Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. President Yoon wrapped up his schedule at the NATO Summit on Wednesday and the same day headed to Poland for a state visit. While in Lithuania, South Korea and NATO institutionalized a framework for cooperation by establishing the ITPP, increasing the number of areas of cooperation to 11. A series of talks also took place, including a four-party summit with other countries from the Asia-Pacific region and bilateral summits such as one with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Today's edition of Within the Frame aims to provide a wrap-up of the president's activities in Lithuania. And for this, we invite Professor An Junseong from Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Professor An, welcome.
Thank you.
And we also have Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Professor Kelly, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, first question to our Professor An. Now, as a leader of an observer country, President Yoon attended this year's NATO summit. What is this observer position and what does it mean for South Korea to attend this meeting for 2 consecutive years?
No, that's a very interesting question. And then, well, I have to start beginning with the correction here, because that, as a matter of law, there's no observer status at the NATO at this time. So they just call it observer. I'm not quite sure how some Korean media use the term observer, but because that from international law perspective, for example, like United Nations, they have a special term like a permanent observer. And so when you say using the observer term, means then there's kind of a candidate member state to become a full member, something. So there's kind of implication there. So I guess that we should not use that observer the term. Instead, they officially, according to NATO, they use the global partner.
Global partner.
Yeah, I think that's the correct term. The media have to use it, global partner. So.
All right.
And about 2 consecutive years, yeah, it's very interesting. From last year, the NATO initiated kind of further deepening the relations with the Asian Pacific countries, including Korea, right? So I think that's the one they started, and then they invited as the group, right? As group of 4, and Korea was one of them. Then because I guess the point is here that at this moment, the NATO need Korea more than Korea need NATO.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's I think the things how I see my perspectives.
Right. Professor An, one more question. So like you said, inviting South Korea is part of NATO's efforts to deepen its collaboration with major countries in Indo-Pacific partners, or should I say Asia-Pacific partners. And before we delve into the details, why is building a relationship with these countries in this region so important in NATO's point of view?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 factors I think that NATO is considered very important. First was obviously the Russian issue because of the Ukraine war, and second is the China factor, since they see it as a systematic threat, something like kind of future concern, and just like what President Biden think about China, look at it as ultimate enemy, right? And then lastly, I'm not sure how much NATO really care about North Korean nuclear threat because it's kind of far away, and it's not really, direct conflict with North Korea because some of the European countries has much better relation than South Korea or the U.S., right? So I guess that's the things that in order for them to invite us to join their meetings, I guess they need something. Some reason for us to be there, right? So I think that's kind of their third priority, the factor about North Korean nuclear threat, right? However, I just put it more put it there in that situation here. Also, that there's difference about AP4, and because some Korean media using the AP4, the Asian Pacific 4, but actually I checked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. They call it IP4.
IP4.
Yeah, interesting. I looked it up, New Zealand and then Australia. I said, oh, this IP4, and I found I checked the NATO website. They call it IP4.
Oh, okay.
The Indo-Pacific 4. I think that I checked the Korean presidential office. They press release they call AP4. I think they should correct it to IP4.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, during the meeting with his counterparts from the Indo-Pacific region, President Yoon urged the establishment of a strong collective security posture. How specifically could these 4 countries work together in this area?
Yeah, so I think the Yoon presidency, generally the president and the staff around him, believe that Korea should play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific, that it shouldn't be sort of trapped or mired just in Korea, just sort of in this sort of relationship with North Korea of 2 scorpions in the bottle, and I think Yoon wants sort of a wider view. This is, I think, in real contradistinction to the Moon administration, which really focused very heavily on North Korea alone, right? And I think the Yoon argument is that Korea will find greater security if it does that, right? That Korea is sort of facing challenges not just from North Korea, but also obviously from China and to a certain extent from Russia, even if it's arguably in decline, right? And so it makes sense for the Yoon administration to reach out to partners in the region, right? Of course, the Americans have pushed this, and the Americans are sort of Korea's most important strategic partner, so it kind of makes sense for the Koreans to at least sort of kind of nod in the direction of what the Americans are looking for, right? And all these countries sort of share basic values and concerns about China's rise and stuff like that, right? I'm looking at your screen there, right? You know, Australia and Japan, all these countries are sort of worried about the same kind of things. So in a sense, it makes good sense, right? I mean, there's a sort of, you know, obvious sort of centrality or jointness of interest here, right? I think it's a little different than NATO, right? Because the countries are much more widely spread apart, whereas in NATO, you have a lot of geographic contiguity, right? You also have the unique sort of historical issues between Korea and Japan. But I mean, the general concern that China is rising, North Korea's nuclear weapons are dangerous, you know, these unite countries in Asia, even arguably India, I would say too, right? And these countries should be sort of getting together to work roughly to push back on this. And I think that logic is pretty clear, just from sort of looking at the map. And I think the Yoon government has grasped that, and the partners in the region, you know, obviously like that, right? I mean, the Australians and the Indians and so on, and Japanese want that too. And so I think you're getting a meeting of the minds.
Right, I see. Professor Kelly, one more question to you. The leaders of this four-party summit, they said they will seek to institutionalize a cooperation framework with NATO and take a leading role in regional security. What does this tightening cooperation between NATO and this AP4 countries mean? I mean, how would this be viewed by other countries like China or Russia?
Yeah, this is tricky, right? Sort of whether or not NATO should have some kind of sustained presence in Asia and vice versa, right? And which have sort of like the emergence of kind of like some kind of Asian NATO or some kind of embryonic thing, right? With the idea of like the Quad or the Quad plus 2 or 3 or whatever, right? Is that kind of like an embryonic Asian NATO? And if it is, should it be linked to sort of the NATO in the North Atlantic, right? And all these ideas are kind of floating around in the background. I think the larger concern here is that there is a commonality of interest across these democracies, particularly about China, less so about North Korea and Russia, both of which have significant power constraints, right? Russia's in decline, North Korea's in, you know, pretty small. Without its nuclear weapons, we wouldn't be worrying about it so much. I think the real issue for the future is China. Everybody's worried about that, right? I mean, you know, not just the Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians, but a lot of European countries, the Americans. And so it kind of makes sense for these countries all to sort of talk together, right? I mean, the more China talks a sort of tough revisionist game, which it has done under Xi Jinping, right? The rhetoric is a lot tougher than it was 10 or 15 years ago, the more that's going to drive the democracies together. And of course, this is something that the Biden administration has emphasized a lot, right? That world politics is sort of this contest between autocracies and democracies, right? And the democracies cooperate. And, you know, if you believe in democracy and liberalism, I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? I mean, the Koreans and the Germans and the Americans and the Australians all share a basic set of values, and all of them worry about other democracies being eliminated, right? I mean, Europeans would worry if Taiwan got invaded. You know, Asian countries like Japan and Korea and Australia worry about Ukraine getting invaded. So, I mean, there's a commonality of interest, a commonality of shared values. And it's not, I don't think it's too surprising that all these countries are sort of knitting themselves together. It's going to take a long time, and there's no big formal institution coming soon. But I mean, the basic idea that they should all be working together for strategic and political reasons, democracy, I don't think that's really up for much debate anymore. I think that's pretty well established at this point.
All right, I see. So commonality of these shared values are making them work together. Now, Professor An, tapping on specific deal between South Korea and NATO, they adopted an individually tailored partnership program, or ITPP, so they say. But before we delve deeper into this, as far as I know, they already had this partnership called Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. What is the difference between ITPP and this IPCP?
Well, just put it there. Given the fact that there is no, you know, the status issue, right? It's not really open to the membership to the Korea or Japan. It's more like invited to be participated to the NATO Summit meetings, right? And things about last time when NATO invited Korea, well, not in Korea, Korea and Japan, for two other nations, right? Basically, when they invited, we kind of signed up like agreement. Bilateral, well, each bilateral, right, with the NATO, Korea and the NATO, Japan and NATO, right? And they become like it's not really member, but become like a ally, partner, global partner membership. So you have a global partner membership, and this one is our ITPP is upgrade version, means that we have a specific area of the cooperation, specific 11 areas you focus on it. So we have more detail. I think that the previous arrangement is really general description or about what to do. We cooperated, but this one is more specific areas to cooperate, how they cooperate. I think that's a much more advancement, and then development is a very good sign. However, I'm looking at the Japanese side. Interesting, Japan already signed the same contract earlier, and then they had a cooperation area is the 16 compared to 11, right?
Oh.
So, and plus there's a big about news. If you see that the Japanese government tried to open the liaison office, NATO, like what the Professor Kelly say, the Asian NATO, right? Basically, they tried to open at Tokyo at the liaison office, but some of the NATO countries, including France, kind of disagree with it. So they don't want expansion to the Asia. So that's one issue. And plus, very interesting. I checked the press release and the NATO website, and I think July 12, I think the Secretary General saying that Japan is closer than any other country, so any partner. So it's they show very strong, I guess, interest in Japan. But I think that about this NATO, visiting about issue here, that we have to think about big picture. You see, what is our national interest for the Korean, right? What is the national interest for Korea? Are we doing our best for our best interest, or are we doing something is not doing best for some other countries? I think that's a big question they have to ask themselves.
Right, I see. So to sum up, the ITPP is an upgraded version and a detailed version than IPCP. So Professor Kelly, the partnership has been upgraded and has expanded bilateral cooperation to 11 sectors, including for example, disarmament and non-proliferation. Could you give us details on what areas this program covers?
Yeah, so I think the future is sort of jointness and some level of integration, right? And we know that arms control, the Yoon administration has emphasized this a lot, right? I mean, just the other day, the president said this, right? Arms control is a big thing, in part because of North Korea, right? South Korea is sort of increasingly facing a missilized North Korea. It's very clear that if we're ever going to get real security in South Korea, it's going to require some kind of cap or some kind of constraint on North Korea's missilization. Missile defense doesn't work well enough, so the Yoon administration is emphasizing disarmament, right? I presume this also means, again, we don't know. We'll have to see how this sort of shakes out, right? It's sort of like the nuclear consultative group. It's between the U.S. and Korea. It's going to sort of take life as it sort of gets put together on the fly. I would imagine sort of also in the future going to concern issues like nuclear security and non-proliferation. Again, sort of from the Korean perspective, this is all pretty important, right? And larger arms control, again, that would probably be, that would sort of move around, that would sort of begin to focus on sort of China and Taiwan, right? And concerns, maybe we can have some kind of like maritime caps or something like that, so the United States and China don't tumble into a major naval race in the region, the same way they saw between sort of Britain and France, for example, Britain and Germany before World War I. Right, so I would imagine that all these kinds of issues, interoperability, arms control, finding a way to sort of like hammer out differences to create sort of a common front on shared issues like Ukraine, Taiwan, North Korea. I would imagine that all those things are sort of floating in the background, and that's sort of, again, sort of looking at the pictures there, right? I mean, all this stuff will sort of come together, right? Whether or not there'll be actually formal mechanisms that sort of that are actually stood up, something like an Asian NATO, I'm kind of doubtful there. Instead, what you get is sort of per the title there, right? You'll get a lot of intergovernmental interaction. You'll probably see the Koreans and the Japanese invited more and more to things like the G7, the G20, well, they're already in that, NATO and things like that, right? And an effort to kind of like build some kind of basic intergovernmental structure, some kind of regular symmetry that brings all the democracies under one umbrella to sort of push for the same things, right? Sort of like nuclear disarmament across the board, for example, would be an obvious one, which could capture North Korea, right? Some kind of constraints on sort of like maritime operations in East Asia, right? Some kind of rules of the road for the South China Sea, so that we can find a way, hopefully, to track China into better behavior, right? All the democracies share interest in that, and I would imagine that those are the kinds of things that will show up.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor An, increasing military information sharing with the NATO alliance was another agreement reached. And though details were not shared, the presidential office said that what President Yoon was referring to NATO's BICES, which was Battlefield Information Collection and Exploitation System. What is this about, and how is this expected to benefit South Korea?
It's a very interesting question, because I ask myself, why they want to share it, right? And then I look it up, and interesting about here that the, let me begin with this perspective. It says like A4 or the AP4 or IP4, right, is invited as a group by the NATO. It's not Korean government approached NATO, like, we want to join your whatever region, right? They're not going to accept it because of their discretion to whether or not they invited non-member state. So basically they need us, I mean Korea and other countries, to join them for their own purposes, right? So what I'm hearing about here, interesting is that the way they got joined that, I mean, kind of invited, actually the NATO General Secretary suggests, the Korean government to join the BICES. It's very interesting because if you look at the other way, it's a very sensitive information. It's military, including nuclear information. So if some other non-member state, I would like to share your military, sensitive military information data networks, no country will say, oh yes, right? Unless they invited to do so. But that's one thing that NATO initiated. And second is that there is not really highly sensitive information level. I guess that there's a basic level of information they're sharing, and then already we are sharing with the U.S. anyway, right? So it's not really big deal about in terms of the sensitivity of information. Now the last one is I was very wondering about it's called like BICES, battlefield. It's like, what do you mean battlefield? We're far away from the Europe, right? So it's more. I think they were kind of expanding the idea about the scope of the battlefield into the cyberspace, cyber warfare, and then hacking or something like that. So those could also like some having so relates to hack some system and about the cryptocurrency issues, right? So there's I guess there would be might be degree of cooperation between IP4 and the NATO. Yes, they should, but at this moment we it's because of the sensitive information, they're not going to government will not share how much they're sharing the information, but well we wait and see how much. But I think that's a good sign. We have I think there's a NATO side perspective is that they will try to sending a political message to their enemies like Russia and China, or we're sharing military information like you sharing with your brothers, right? Comrade, right? Basically, I think there's more of a political gesture from the NATO side.
All right, I see. So in that case, that being said, could we say this BICES thing is very much focused on cybersecurity and a political gesture to show perhaps China and Russia that we are all together?
From the NATO perspective, I think.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, Yoon also took part in bilateral summits with leaders of more than 10 countries, for example, like Norway and the Netherlands. What significance does having such bilateral summits with European countries have? And specifically, what areas were focused on?
Yeah, so again, I think this is sort of part of the general approach from the Yoon government to sort of widen Korea's reach, sort of global Korea. Korean conservative governments have often talked this way, right? That Korea should have sort of this wider footprint, it should play a larger role. I think there's this desire to sort of break away from the perception that South Korean foreign policy is entirely structured by the competition with North Korea. Again, sort of looking at the footage here, right? You can see sort of Yoon shaking hands with various leaders and stuff like that, and right to sort of raise the profile of Korea as sort of this larger and a more important state, right? Korea is the world's 10th biggest economy, so it's systemically important, right? So presumably it has important trade and financial relationships with many of these partners, right? And I think the Yoon administration wants to kind of layer on top of that an increasing security relationship, again, for the reasons I sort of talked about before, right? The perception that South Korea is sort of, if you will, broadly speaking, in the democratic camp, in this sort of emerging contest, right, where you have sort of like China and Russia, which have grown significantly closer because of the war, and also North Korea, right, which is kind of floating around in that camp too. And North Korea is really on the front line of that contest, right? And if there's ever a Korean war, there's a second Korean war, Korea is going to reach out, not just the United States, but presumably to most of the democratic world and say, help us, sanctions and things like that, right? So I would caution against the arguments made that, what's going on in Ukraine doesn't really matter to us, that's sort of far away, and NATO is sharing, they want our information, stuff like that, and it's not that important for us. I would really strongly disagree with that, right? If things go hot in Korea, if there's a conflict in Korea, all these relationships you see right there are going to become really, really important for Korea in order to sanction China, sanction North Korea, right? Sort of keep a Korean war from becoming, a really, not a defeat, but, like a major catastrophe for South Korea. South Korea is going to want a lot of allies, and sort of participating in the coalition that supports Ukraine is a good way for South Korea to sort of prove that it's a good sort of global citizen among democracies. So when South Korea calls for help, other countries will assist it, right? And that, I think, is really the background story of what Yoon is doing. With the financial relationships and trade relationships, that's all great. But what really matters ultimately for Korea, I think, is the security issue, right? Which is that Korea is fairly exposed. It's right next to China. It's right next to North Korea. It's right next to Russia. And if things ever get really bad, if there's ever a conflict out here, Korea is right on the front line, and it's going to want a lot of allies. And I think the Yoon administration really realizes that, right? And sort of being friends with the Americans and the Japanese isn't enough. it helps to have a much, much wider reach. And that's, I think, why the Yoon government is emphasizing this idea of sort of democratic collectivity so much more.
Right, I see your point in that South Korea is trying to have more allies in case there is anything happening on the peninsula. Now, Professor An, now among many bilateral summits, talks with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida was the one that gathered a lot of attention, and Tokyo tried to reassure Seoul about the release of the wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Now, how did you see the developments of the discussion?
Yeah, very interesting development. And I read the official press release by the president's office. Basically, I think they have 3 points, right? First is that they want from Japan's government immediate, the real-time information sharing about what's going on, whatever happens. And the second is that the Korean government want Korean experts to participate in the monitoring process. Right. And the last one is that if something bad thing happen, they want an immediate stop about something bad thing happen or exceeding their some sort of safety level, and then immediate notification to Korea. Yeah, I guess both parties agree. But however, it's very interesting. I think that the bilateral relationship between Korea and Japan has very historical, bearing. A lot of things happens. But let me ask you the, very interesting question. Is that the Korea and Japan friends now? I remember I just watching. I saw in that. I think that the Prime Minister Kishida saying something like "안녕하세요," right? Something. Well, I think it's a good gesture. But I checked the Foreign Affairs Office on the website, and I was very surprised how they describe the situation here in Korea. I mean, the NATO. And according to the Minister of Foreign Affairs Japan, they call the way the order they put country in Korea. Well, historically we call like in Korea and U.S., maybe probably China and Japan, and then other countries. But they put it like Japan, Austria, New Zealand, and Korea. There's official statement. I was very surprised, and because considering the geographic, proximity, or Asian, New Zealand and far away from Japan, and they put it, and I guess if they want to be really showing their effort, something, I guess they other than just speaking something, they should be treated. By showing the good effort, good gesture effort, and they change their policy, their attitude about how they deal with Korea. I mean, because a lot of history between two countries, but if we're going to change a new start, and they have to do some work, because that there's some Koreans kind of criticizing about Yoon administration. They're giving everything, give away everything, but what are you getting in return, right? So great things they at least show that some gesture or something. Yeah, I guess that's kind of things that I'm expecting from the Japanese side, showing some goodwill gesture to the Korea. That's will help developing, improving the bilateral relation between two countries.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kelly, I believe this will be our last question. President Yoon is now in Poland, actually, with a press briefing soon to take place following a meeting with his Polish counterpart. What discussions could we expect to have taken place?
Oh, specifically with Poland? Oh, I would imagine that a lot. First of all, I mean, there's going to be the sort of like the basic sort of Korean effort to get the World Expo down here in Busan, right? That would be really great for us, right? I think one of the things that Yoon is doing up there in Europe is trying to sort of rustle up votes. So, good for him. I hope he gets it, right? And then the sort of the standard kind of export relationships, right? I mean, Korea is an export-driven economy. You all know this, right? Korea exports a lot to Europe, so I would imagine that Yoon is sort of banging away on that. But again, I would argue, as I have throughout this interview, that the larger strategic context is what really matters, right? The Eastern European countries are a much more important part of NATO than they were 15, 20 years ago. They are now on the front line against Russia. They're all going to be spending a great deal more on defense in the future, right? Because of the obvious parallels between the Ukraine conflict and a Taiwan scenario, or arguably a Korean scenario. I think, again, there's sort of a lot of interest in, well, how the Europeans are helping Ukraine. Would you see a larger effort to assist South Korea in a Korean contingency? Would you see a larger effort to assist Taiwan in a regional contingency there with the Chinese, right? I mean, I think the Yoon administration would argue that they kind of accept the sort of Biden argument that all these democracies are more or less in the same place, that they're all kind of looking at the same collection of autocratic actors, a lot of them quite honestly supported by Chinese money and trade, to be perfectly blunt, right? And that we need to find a way, right? We, the democracies, need to find a way to sort of stand together and push back on this. And Poland is one of the biggest actors in NATO now, right? I mean, it's now the most important Eastern European country in NATO, right, which means it's really the front line. On Russia, it's been very, very hard and tough on Russia, and very supportive of Ukraine, right? And again, sort of if you're in an Asian state like South Korea or Taiwan and you're exposed to that kind of competition from China, and North Korea, those are the kinds of partners I think you want. And I think that's what Yoon is doing. I think the strategy stuff is really the backdrop. The trade issues are, they're nice, but I would argue the strategic issues are what really matter here.
All right, I see. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Kelly, for your insights, and Professor An for your insights as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.